Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in the philosophy of mind. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the challenges to substance dualism. So, I'd like to think that the last lesson last week presented quite a strong and convincing argument for the existence of substance dualism, for the distinction of the mind and the body in relation to this idea of Cartesian skepticism. But let's think about some of the critiques, some of the challenges that are presented by substance dualism, and then start to think about other variations of dualism, including property dualism as well as predicate dualism. Maybe they present something of a better argument for why there is this distinction between mind and body, before we then look at the various challenges to those types of dualism, and then we go and look at some physicalist theories and explain why they might be more apt. So we'll look at a variety of attacks levied against Cartesian substance dualism in this lesson. Specifically, the challenges that we're going to look at include the mind-body problem. So I've sort of generalized the mind-body problem in this lesson, but we will talk about the mind-body problem in terms of more detail as we go on in future lessons time. It's a recurring issue, the mind body problem, and we will look at various attempts to try and answer that question and to try and resolve this issue. We're going to look at the challenge of the problem of other minds, and then finally we will look at the challenge of epiphenomenalism. Okay, now epiphenomenalism is something that I believe I'll probably do a lesson on in the future anyway, but I'll just cover it briefly here because it does pertain to or does present something of a challenge to this idea of substance dualism. So let's begin there. The mind-body problem. Let's think about this first. Well, this is probably one of the most significant criticisms of substance dualism. Essentially, one of the things that the mind-body problem invites us to ask is the problem of explaining how the non-physical mind can interact with the physical body. So Descartes makes the argument not only that there is a distinction between mind and body, that there is a distinction between the physical and the mental, but that this physical and mental distinction does still have interaction. There is an interaction between the mind and the body. And it makes sense to suggest that. I think any dualist's theory pretty much is going to have to try and explain this interaction. Because if we're thinking about the mind and the body, we're assuming that there is some interaction here. A mental state has to, at some point and in some kind of way, be interacting with the brain state, or the mental state must still be interacting with the physical entity. So I think it's important that I really, really quickly outline when I say these things what I mean. So a mental state in this conception is the mental element of a particular experience. So if I take the experience of pain, the experience of feeling pain is the mental state of pain. The brain state, when I talk about brain states, I'm talking about the experience that we can physically see in the brain when somebody experiences some pain, okay? So if I stub my toe, all right, there will be parts of the brain that will light up, okay? And that will be the part of the brain that is the pain sector, shall we say. And that is what I'm talking about when I think about brain states. Brain states are physical things. They are physical entities or physical experiences that are taking place within the brain because we can measure them, we can see them, we can measure the activity in the brain that is taking place. A mental state refers to that subjective experience of feeling pain, okay, the feeling of pain. Now, some people, as we will get to in future lessons time, would just suggest that, well, these are just one and the same thing. A mental state and a brain state are just the same, okay? That the experience of pain, the sort of physical, subjective feeling of pain, is just the mental state of the part of the brain lighting up. A dualist can't make that conclusion, though, because a dualist has to conclude that the mind and the body are separate. So the physical thing that is going on in the brain, the fibers and the neurons that are actually firing when you stub your toe, okay, has to be distinct from the subjective experience of feeling pain that you have when you stub your toe. Now, the problem that a dualist has, and this is the mind-body problem, is how do these things interact? Because there does seem to be interaction, okay? When I stub my toe, two things will happen, okay? Well, three things will happen. The first thing is I'll probably swear, but then the two things that will happen is that the brain will fire, okay? There will be activity in the brain that is consistent with our understanding scientifically and neuroscientifically of pain. But there will also be an experience that I have. I hurt. It hurts, okay? And that's why I swear, okay? There is a reaction that takes place. There is a mental state, there is a brain state. And according to a dualist, they are separate things. So how do they interact with each other? How can you explain that interaction? Now, if the mind is immaterial, then how can it affect the material world? Now, don't forget, the Cartesian dualist, the Cartesian substance dualist, relies on the fact that the mind is immaterial, because one of the arguments for dualism is this idea of indivisibility and immateriality, and that how this is, because the mind is indivisible and the body is divisible, they therefore cannot be the same thing. So in order to even accept substance dualism, we have to sort of, to a degree, accept that the mind is immaterial. But then we then run into the second problem is, well, if it is immaterial, how can it affect the material world? How does my mental experience of physically feeling pain have any kind of impact on the brain state that results from me stubbing my toe? Because if it is immaterial, then how can it interact with it? This idea of causal interaction remains a significant point of contention for dualists. One of the major critiques, at least when Descartes was writing, came from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. She critiqued this idea. She critiqued this element of this element of substance dualism, and Descartes wrote back, and they sort of had a little bit of an interaction in terms of their critiques, but it still remains a significant problem. How do you resolve this interaction? Another issue is the problem of other minds. Now, the problem of other minds essentially asks the question of, if minds are non-physical and cannot be directly observed, how can we know that other people have minds? Okay? How can we know that other minds even exist? You might just be the only mind that exists. Okay? A Cartesian dualist, by simply emphasizing this first-person access to one's mind, this subjective experience that one person has, leads to very strong difficulties in being able to account for how we can essentially know that other people have subjective experiences like our own. How do I know, for example, that my partner has the same experience when she stubs her toe versus when I stub mine? How do I know that that is the same thing? We can sort of assume that it's the same thing, because when she stubs her toe, she also swears, and she also is in pain in the same way that I feel like I'm in pain, okay? I could measure her brain when she stubs her toe, and maybe the exact same parts of the brain will interact, will fire up, will light up when she stubs her toe. But that's a physical experience. Remember, there is still a distinction here between the mind and the body, the brain state and the mental state. So how do I know that the mind, the subjective experience of the mind, that is non-physical and therefore cannot be directly observed, how can I know that that is the same as the experience that I have on my own? That's another question that you have to resolve. The final critique is this idea of epiphenomenalism. Now, epiphenomenalism is suggested that by some philosophers that even if dualism is true, perhaps the mind does not actually cause physical events, but rather an epiphenomenon. Okay, an epiphenomenon is something that arises from the physical processes of the brain, but has no causal power over the brain. Now, we will get to epiphenomenalism in far more detail in future lessons' time. So, essentially, what this is trying to present the argument here is that it's trying to challenge the Cartesian idea of interactionism, the idea that there is an interaction between the mind and the body in relation to Cartesian substance dualism. Because epiphenomenalism is suggesting that, well, maybe there actually isn't this cause of physical events, but rather there is an epiphenomenon. There is something that arises from the physical processes of the brain, but has no causal power over those physical processes. This is a view that grapples with this issue of interaction, but does it from a different angle. And that's why it's quite a strong critique of dualism. Now, you might think that I've gone quite light on substance dualism in terms of these challenges and critiques. The reason for that is because I will look at other challenges to dualism when I look at property dualism and predicate dualism that also applies to substance dualism. There are sort of challenges that are quite specific to Cartesian dualism. So the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia was challenging. She was challenging specifically Descartes and his dualist thinking. But there are also various challenges to just the idea of dualism in its generality. And these are challenges that even a property dualist or a predicate dualist has to grapple with as much as a substance dualist would have to. And in addition to this, we will look at epiphenomenalism in more detail in its own separate series of lessons. So all of this means that we will be really kicking dualism into the dirt as we go on further and further and deeper into these lessons. So don't worry about that.